I have a special treat tonight. It is unbelievable. I absolutely love it. This is going to be great. We are talking about the Supreme Court decision here. SCOTUS has recently, late last week, well, probably still this week, it depends on we're Sunday. They struck down President Trump's tariffs, his use of I'm probably going to get I think 122. I'm barely up to speed on this stuff. Okay. I'm up to speed a little bit. And now what happens next? Well, we are joined by Matthew Seligman. I hope I pronounced that right. I probably pronounced that wrong, and please correct me.
You got it.
Okay. And he has taught at Stanford. This person has gone to Stanford. He's got his own firm, Grayhawk Law. We're going to talk all about that. He has also done some great work with Professor Lemley, Mark Lemley, who is from my alma mater, okay, UC Berkeley, go Bears, Berkeley Law, but he is an eminent professor over there at Stanford Law in IP, and they did an amicus brief, which is basically they wrote a brief to kind of, for this case, saying, hey, here's our arguments, here's what we think, and look, their side won. So this is big. I want to talk to him, and we want to get into all of these types of things. Now, I'll say this at the top, and again, any question he doesn't want to answer, he doesn't need to answer. There's no softballs, there's no gotchas, anything like that. I want to talk about, I'm conservative. I voted for President Trump, but I think this whole issue cuts across different lines. I'm not speaking for anyone, but I mean, just my own estimation, my own personal opinion. It wouldn't surprise me if Mark is pretty liberal out there. Not sure he's a fan of President Trump's, but he is really smart, does incredible work there at Stanford. Not uncommon, maybe with the legal profession in the Bay Area there. And he was kind enough to put me in touch with Matthew, kind enough to give their time in here. And I really respect their work. And we need conversations like this where different people can talk to each other. And there are some politics here, but there are things way beyond politics here. And there's a constitutional law aspect of it, is in terms of just not even pro or con the tariffs, but who decides. So I want to turn it over to Matthew to tell us who you are, how you got involved in this, and we'll start there, and then maybe give us the run up on the case here.
Great, and thanks for having me on, John. So a little bit about myself. My name's Matthew Seligman. I'm the founder and principal of Grayhawk Law, and I am also a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School. And so let me tell you a bit about how I got involved in this case. So over the past several years, I've, among other things, represented a group of usually conservative former government officials who have filed amicus briefs in a variety of the high-profile cases that have come through the courts over the last, say, 3 or 4 years to represent what they think is a conservative point of view that isn't necessarily the same as the Trump point of view.
Right.
And so that's what I did in this case. And so this is the tariff case. So President Trump, early last year in 2025, instituted a series of tariffs. And of course, they changed a bit. And so some of them are against China, Mexico, Canada. And then there were the worldwide, what he called the reciprocal tariffs that he announced on what he called Liberation Day. Now, the president doesn't just get to impose tariffs on his own. That's not a power that the Constitution gives to the president. Like the power to collect taxes, that's a power that the Constitution very clearly gives to Congress. Now, over the years, specifically with respect to the regulation of international trade, but also just across the board, Congress has passed more and more statutes that have given the president power to act, even if he didn't have the intrinsic constitutional power to act. And this is the potential source of power that President Trump is relying on to impose these tariffs. And in particular, there's the statute called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEEPA. And President Trump relied on this statute to say, hey, I can impose these tariffs on China, on Mexico, on Canada, and then the whole world. And so the question before the Supreme Court, and the decision came down, as you said, on Friday, is whether this statute, IEEPA, gives President Trump or any president the power to impose tariffs. And if it does, under what circumstances? So this is really, as you said, a question of, who decides who has the power? Do we have to go to Congress to have them pass a new law that says we're going to impose these tariffs that President Trump wants? Or does he already have the power based on this old statute? And what the Supreme Court decided on Friday is this old statute doesn't give him the power to do it.
Okay. And we see this kind of discussion with somewhat like the War Powers Act, right? I mean, Congress is supposed to declare war, and yet we see a lot of presidents that are involved in military action. Some people have talked about maybe what's happening up here, and we're not going to swerve, but just to kind of try to broaden this discussion out a little bit and maybe bring it home to the viewers out there with maybe what's happening potentially with Iran, what happened maybe before with Iran. And I mean, I guess there's the tension between what is required in a modern administrative state versus what the Constitution might say, versus also each, different branch of government that they kind of vie for power at different times, maybe consciously or unconsciously, but there's this little give and take. Can you discuss maybe a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this most recent tariff decision and the assertion of executive power that President Trump engaged in, he's not the first president to do something like this. Now, the economic consequences of these tariffs are just orders of magnitude higher than a lot of the other types of issues we've seen presidents try to handle on their own without Congress. And so this is big. There's no question about that. But over not just the last year, but over the decades, there has been a long process of the accretion of power to the president. And Congress has more and more, sometimes just passed statutes that give the president more and more and more power. And sometimes, as with the War Powers Act and the absence of congressional action when it comes to all of these military strikes, Congress has been shrinking away from the powers that it has.
Yeah.
And that cuts across political parties, that cuts across administrations. And the reasons why this happens, the reason why it's happened is because the exigencies of the modern world seem to demand quick and decisive action, and Congress more and more has become deadlocked. And so the result of that dynamic, where we need a government who can take action, but Congress is slow if it really does anything at all, has resulted in this long-term trend where presidential power has increased. What was called, even in the 1960s, the imperial presidency.
Right.
And that's just gone further and further and further. And this is another example of that. Now, where do the courts come in? Well, a lot of people would say that the courts haven't stepped in enough to say, no, the president can't assert this power, and really it's Congress's job. But sometimes it does. And I'll give you two examples that come from two different political parties' presidents. The first is President Biden's student loan cancellation program, where he was relying on a statute, the HEROES Act, which, the text of the statute may or may not have given him the authority to cancel student debt. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. This statute doesn't give you the power to cancel student debt. And so if you want to do that, you got to go to Congress. So, that was some tens of billions of dollars at stake there. And then now we have this tariff case where the dynamic is exactly the same. President Trump could have gone to Congress and said, hey, I have this great idea. We should do tariffs. I campaigned on it. I'd love you to pass a new law, and I'll sign it, that says we want more tariffs. We want these worldwide tariffs. We want these tariffs against China and so on. He didn't do that. And there may be political realities that he was confronting in his decision not to do that. But then the Supreme Court again stepped in and said, nope, sorry, the existing statute on the books doesn't give you that power. So this is another chapter in a really long-term trend about the accretion of presidential power, and then the courts sometimes stepping in and limiting it.
Do you feel that, what's your guess about Congress? Do you think that Congress is going to do anything about this, or they're not? I'm going ahead a little bit, and I want to get into the case in you and Mark, but I know that they're working on, I think Secretary Benson was talking on the Sunday shows, and then the trade representative was also talking on the Sunday shows that, look, they're going to look under other statutes for authority, whether it's the 301 or the 232, to get the tariffs done or short-term basis. But I do think at some point Congress probably has to weigh in on this, right?
Well, we'll see. And I think that the political realities of whether any legislation at all about tariffs can pass right now reflects kind of the deeper problem that has led us to this imperial presidency in the first place. Um, so just counting the votes, I don't think that there's any chance that we're going to have a statute that's passed and signed by President Trump that either confirms the tariffs. Congress could pass a law tomorrow that says, hey, this old statute didn't do it, but we're retroactively going to say yes to all those tariffs. There's a new law that says those tariffs were okay. But Congress isn't going to pass that law. They tried and they don't have the votes.
Mhm.
If you're reading the political tea leaves, I'm guessing they're probably not going to have the votes starting in January 2027 either. So we're not going to get a statute that approves of these tariffs. Now, will we get a statute that sort of flat out rejects them and says, President Trump, you can't impose new tariffs? Maybe, but President Trump would veto that law. And so we're locked in this place where, the only thing that you're hearing about right now is what other existing statutes President Trump and his administration might try to rely on to try to recreate. And that's the word they're using, recreate the tariffs that they already had using these other existing statutory authorities. And that, frankly, is to a certain extent a reflection of the gridlock that we see where we can't get a yes and we can't get a no out of Congress and the president through new legislation.
It's interesting, and again, I'm going too far, probably too far again. And this will be my last one. We'll go step by step.
Mhm.
After that, I'll try. Is we talked about the modern administrative state. We talked about how with the tariff situation. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, Steel Town, and it used to be the Democratic Party was really pro-union and pro tariffs and stuff like that. And now you have the MAGA wing, but again, like you said, the traditional Republicans are more conservative. Maybe some of the think tank types and stuff like that are like, hey, we want limited government, we want lower taxes and free trade and all that type of stuff. It does seem, well, I don't want to speak for you, but there's a critique out there that Congress is somewhat captured by corporate or elite donor interests out there to some degree. Are we at a point, whether it's healthcare, student loans, tariffs, different things, that can Congress function as it used to? Is it how? Let me put it another way. I don't like that phrasing. Let me revise and extend. Are we at a point where there's challenges to effective representative republic under the Constitution?
I mean, the answer to that question is clearly yes. And you and I could talk for, a whole other separate couple hours about that. And now the way that it shows up here, I mean,
Yes.
one of the things that's happening here is that you get something that we've seen over the last decade, President Trump, whether you're a fan or not, he certainly has scrambled the politics in certain ways.
Yeah.
You have him, he's been a fan of tariffs for a very, very long time. And so he's at odds with the Wall Street Journal, editorial board now. And then you've seen Democrats actually coming in and being a little bit more free trade, which is certainly not, you said you grew up in Western Pennsylvania,
Right.
not what you would have guessed.
Right.
And so now there are, of course, some Republicans who are still free trade focused. And that's part of the reason why there aren't enough votes for new tariff statutes. But it makes politics really challenging for someone who wants these new tariffs. Now, the question then is what the upshot of that is. So it seems like one thing you might say is, look, well, we've got political gridlock, but we as a nation, we need to act. And so the result of this is we should just let the president do it. He is the only person who's been elected by all of the American people, along with the vice president. And so he's got a popular mandate that nobody else has. And to that, I would say, speaking to a conservative, let's go back to founding principles.
Right.
The founders created the separation of powers. It was their great innovation, drawing on the great thinkers of the age like Montesquieu, saying we are not going to have concentrated power. We are going to separate power. Not so because separated powers means that the government can do as much as possible, but precisely to ensure that no one person had the power to do anything,
Mhm.
because the idea was to separate powers. And sometimes, yeah, you're going to have a little bit less action than you might have if we had, a single elected official, no Congress, no courts, maybe even. It's absolutely true there would be less gridlock there. But the problem is, as the founders recognized, if you design a system like that, sooner or later you're going to get a president, a imperial president with
Right.
no checks on his power that you don't like, and who doesn't like you.
Yep.
And so, the price we pay for a structure of government and the rule of law that preserves liberty in the long run is that, yes, President Trump can't impose his tariffs as quickly as he and his supporters may like. And over the last 2.5 centuries, as we approach the 250th anniversary
Yeah,
of the Declaration
exciting.
of Independence, I think we should really appreciate the fact that we've lasted this long under a system where, yeah, sometimes it's frustrating that we can't act as quickly as we want. And I guarantee you, President Biden had the same kind of frustrations that President Trump has. But this system works better, and it is more durable and a greater preservation of our rights and liberties.
No question. The presidential power that you may like today, you may dread, tomorrow, or
Yeah.
metaphorically tomorrow.
Yeah,
Now,
in 4 years, the shoe's going to be on the other foot. And you got to think about how much power you want to give to the most charismatic, most effective president of the opposing political party.
no question. Now, how did we talked off the air about you went to Stanford Law School. I'm sure that's where you met Professor Lemley. Tell me about how you two got together, how you got involved in this case, and give me the backstory on that.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I was a full-time law professor for a little while. I taught at Harvard. I taught at Cardozo, and then in 2020, I started doing this hybrid, legal scholarship and practice thing. It's sort of piecing together both of those worlds. And as part of my practice, so I'm a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford, and Stanford is of course where Professor Lemley teaches. And also over the past several years, I've filed a ton of amicus briefs in a bunch of cases, including, for example, the presidential immunity case, typically representing a group of conservative former government officials, whether those be White House staff or cabinet secretaries, former members of Congress, former governors, and so on. And typically, they've been asserting what I would call a sort of traditional conservative rule of law perspective that has been at odds with President Trump a lot of the time. And so, in this particular case, along with a nonprofit that I've represented and worked with in the past called Democracy Defenders, we wanted to file this brief on behalf of a similar group of conservative former governmental officials. And so we had amici from every presidential administration from Nixon to Biden, including the first Trump administration. And Professor Lemley and I worked together on this brief. And so we filed in the federal circuit before it even got to the Supreme Court. And then once it hit the Supreme Court, we filed there again.
I have that brief. Did you? I mean, this is your interview. Did you want to go through that? Do you want to just talk through it?
Sure.
Is that cool?
Yeah, and I think for some of your listeners and viewers who are lawyers, there's a little bit of strategic thinking about what our brief said, and how it might be interesting to talk about how we got there. So the power under this statute, there are really two questions. And the question that the court ultimately focused on and ruled on was whether the statute's power to, quote, regulate importation includes the power to impose tariffs. And the Supreme Court in a 6-3 vote said no. And the reason it said so is because there are all sorts of statutes that have given the president the power to impose tariffs, and they always use the word tariffs or duties, which is a synonym for tariffs. And IEEPA pretty conspicuously does not include the words tariffs or duties. And so that was the primary argument. And that's the argument that the plaintiffs in the case, so there were some small businesses, and there were also some states who had sort of separately brought suit. And so that was their argument, that regulate importation doesn't include tariffs. Now, I thought that was right, but I was also concerned that regulate importation is a pretty broad phrase. And so I wanted to give an alternative way for the court to get to the same conclusion. Now, that alternative way is that the statute also says that there are certain preconditions about when the president can, for example, regulate importation. And the phrase is it has to deal with a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat. That's the statutory phrase.
Okay.
And our argument was that worldwide trade deficits that have existed and persisted in every single year since IEEPA was passed in the mid 1970s, so literally for the last 50 years, we've had a trade deficit the entire time. And it's the trade deficit overall, the trade deficit in goods actually isn't larger now than it has been at various other points in the last 20 years. And so our argument was that, okay, you may think that trade deficits are bad and the president gets to have that policy position, but that doesn't count as an unusual and extraordinary threat. And so we thought that this was a good alternative argument if the plaintiff's primary argument that regulate importation doesn't include the power to tariffs. We were saying, look, even if it does include the power to impose tariffs, he doesn't get to do it here because trade deficits, which is what he was trying to respond to with these worldwide tariffs, don't count as an unusual and extraordinary threat. Now, it turns out once oral argument happened back in November, it was very clear to me and to most observers that a majority of the court wasn't even going to bite on the first part of this, the government's position. They said, look, when Congress wants to give the power to impose tariffs, it uses the word tariffs or duties. This statute doesn't. So end of story. So the court didn't even really need to get to that second argument. But this was the strategy here was to give the court a menu of options of different ways where, to reach the ultimate conclusion that the president had exceeded his powers.
So now they're saying here exactly what you're talking about, that IEEPA does not authorize, this is the actual decision here that Mark linked to that I'm pulling up, that it does not authorize President Trump to impose tariffs, and that basically the judgment is vacated and now remanded with instructions to the lower court. Now, also part of that is that I guess the decision as for whether or not there's going to be refunds also is going to the lower court. Like the Supreme Court didn't talk about that.
That's right. The only member of the court who did mention it, and briefly, was Justice Kavanaugh in his dissent, where he, I think it's fair to say, called out the majority opinion for not addressing the question of potential refunds. And he said, and he was quoting from the transcript at oral argument, that it was going to be, quote, a mess. And, whether you agree with the rest of Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, and I don't, I do agree that it's going to be a mess. Now, as somebody who's a Supreme Court litigator, I'm not surprised at all that they didn't address the question of refunds, whether there will be and what process it'll be, because the way the court decides cases is it just takes the issue before it that's been presented to it and decides that, and doesn't decide anything that doesn't need to be decided to resolve that. And then they'll pass it back to the lower courts to try to figure out what the refunds are going to be, whether they're going to be refunds. Now, as it turns out, and so my law firm, Grayhawk Law, represents importers who are starting this process of trying to get refunds. And one thing that that importers are sort of starting to realize is that refunds are not going to be automatic. I think there was a conventional wisdom that once the Supreme Court said that the tariffs were unlawful, that the government would just have to give the money back, kind of like a tax refund. And actually, that's not how trade law works. And so there are sort of very, very exacting and demanding procedural steps that importers need to take in order to potentially get a refund. And these are really time limited. There are deadlines that are passing every day in order to be eligible for a refund. And so this is going to be a real problem because I think importers are just waking up right now to the fact that they're just not going to get a check in the mail automatically the way that you might get a tax refund. And I think it's fair to say that, beginning with President Trump's press conference on Friday, and then you see, after that, his actions, he already imposed a worldwide 10% tariff on Friday afternoon, and then he upped it to 15% on Saturday, and we can talk about the statute he's relying on there. And then what you see the members of his administration, like Treasury Secretary Bessent, what he's saying, what the U.S. Trade Representative is saying, not only are they going to try to recreate these tariffs going forward using other statutory authorities, I do think it's fair to say that it's going to be a fight about whether they're going to give refunds at all. And in particular, President Trump was asked about this at his press conference on Friday, and he said that he was frustrated that the court didn't address the refund issue. And one thing I can say, I think there is probably across the spectrum from me to President Trump, we agree it would have been really nice for the Supreme Court to address the refund issue. But then he said, and now we're going to have to litigate this in court for 5 years. Now he may end up being right about that, but if he is, the reason is because the administration is not just going to give refunds. If they were, there would be no reason for any litigation for 5 years. So the upshot of everything that we've seen over the last 3 days, and again against the background of this of the way trade law works, where you have to file these protests within 180 days, and if you don't, then you lose your refund rights forever. I think we're going to see a really drag-out fight about whether the government is going to give back this, $200-something billion of unlawful tariffs. And stepping back again from, what you think about the policy merits or demerits of tariffs, this idea that, the Supreme Court can issue a holding that clearly says that, the president took, hundreds of billions of dollars from American businesses. And then somehow in a year or 2 years, it turns out the government doesn't have to give it back. To me, that's just wrong. To me, that doesn't seem consistent with the rule of law. If the government takes your money and it turns out it was illegal for the government to take the money, they should have to give it back. And so the idea that there's even really going to be a fight about refunds should, I think, strike a nerve with people. And importers, the people, the businesses, the small, medium, and large businesses who have paid these refunds, they really need to start taking action now to make sure that they preserve their rights to refunds so they don't get caught in a trap later.
It is interesting, and I do want to take the moment here because I know I can talk a lot, and again, feel free. We can wind down anytime that you want to. It's and you can always interrupt me at any time. We're talking about this is Matthew Seligman here from Grayhawk Law. That is his firm out there in Santa Monica. Grayhawk Law is a boutique litigation firm. This is on LinkedIn. People can get in touch with you there. That's maybe one way. Obviously, I'm sure there's several. Grayhawk Law is a boutique litigation firm focused on complex federal matters, including constitutional, administrative, and election-related litigation. The firm represents clients in high-stakes disputes involving constitutional structure, democratic governance, and federal regulatory power, matters where legal outcomes carry institutional consequences beyond the immediate parties. Founded by Matthew A. Seligman, an experienced federal litigator and constitutional scholar, Grayhawk Law is designed for clients who require not only technical excellence, but strategic judgment in cases where law and institutional structure intersect. So I just want to make sure that we got that in there as well. This is fascinating. I mean, you really highlight something. And as we talked about, the numbers here are astounding. I mean, dramatic. We're talking about hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. Some of the estimates out there now, Bessent was on, Secretary Bessent, Treasury Secretary Bessent was saying, hey, I believe Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Morning Futures on Fox, that we're going to go to Congress, we're going to use these other authorities, the numbers aren't going to change. You make the case that, look, these were charged under, the Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional, and therefore they should be refunded. You have, I believe, Governor Pritzker in Illinois saying, hey, all of my constituents, they need to get $1,700 back. People, now President Trump was talking about bonuses to military, maybe Trump bonus checks, stimulus. I mean, there's a lot of people who are counting this money. Now the Apple Cart is upset. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I know you're representing some people out there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, let's separate two questions. One question is what's going to happen to the money that the government has already collected? Now, that's done. The Supreme Court has ruled that was illegal. And so the question is just, do the specific importers who have paid these duties, you get a container shipment of whatever your goods are, and, the Customs and Border Protection assesses a duty, and then there's a process, and so you have to, file paperwork along the way. And then I think importers are actually going to have to file a lawsuit in the Court of International Trade in New York in order to get their money back. And so at the end of that process, importers are due their money back. That was it. The Supreme Court has told us it was illegal to take it. And so if they follow the right procedure along the way, then they should get their money back. Now, of course, you have to follow the right procedure. And something that we know that the government likes to do is not give your money back if you miss a deadline, if you make a paperwork mistake, if you do not cross your T's and dot your I's. And so, what I think is going to happen is that, look, the big businesses, the Walmarts, the Amazons, they've had their law firms working on this the entire time.
Right.
They've been quiet because they don't want to attract attention, but they're going to get their money back.
They'll be ready.
And so the day,
more ready.
they'll be ready.
Yeah.
And so the clients that I represent and who I'm really more worried about, so the numbers I've seen are about 80% of the tariff revenues are paid by the 1,000 largest importers.
Okay.
The Walmarts, the Amazons, and so on.
Yeah.
But 20% are paid by the other 290,000 importers who have paid tariff duties. And that ranges from, just a couple of dollars up to tens of millions of dollars. And these are the small and medium-sized businesses that I've heard every politician ever say are the backbone of the American economy. Now, the question is whether they're going to get their money back.
And they probably can't hire a big law firm and stuff like that. What are you thinking about? Is this like a class action situation?
So unfortunately, class actions are not allowed when you're trying to get a refund of your tariffs. Just like if you're getting a tax refund, you can't do a class action. Now, there are like a couple of footnotes here that like maybe there's a really creative way to do a class action, but I don't think that's going to work. There has never in American history been a successful class action for tariff refunds.
Wow.
And so the upshot of this is that importers are going to have to file their own, it's called a protest, for every single entry, which means payment, of their tariff duties. And then Customs and Border Protection, maybe they grant those protests. Reading the tea leaves, I think they're probably going to deny them. And then the only thing you can do is file an individual lawsuit in the Court of International Trade. Now, so what I'm doing instead is I'm taking these cases purely on contingency. So importers will not pay anything up front, and they will pay a relatively low contingency fee if and only if they ultimately get their refund. Now, the reason why I think this works and is frankly just necessary for small and medium-sized businesses is, businesses have really had to respond to the, let's say, restructuring of the global trade system that was put in place by these tariffs. They're trying to find new suppliers. A lot of production got shifted from China to Vietnam. Some were trying to reshore some of their manufacturing, but that's very difficult in a lot of cases. And also, they couldn't pass on all of these heightened costs to consumers because the market wouldn't bear it. People are really concerned about inflation. Consumers are really concerned about the cost of living, and rents are going up. As I'm sure you talk a lot about the regulatory burden that small businesses face, and as a result of that, they're already getting squeezed. Medium-sized businesses are already getting squeezed, and so they can't devote $10 or $50 or $100,000 for legal fees on the hope that they're going to get their tariff refund check in the mail in 2 or 3 years. And so that, and the upshot of that, again, is if the only option out there for small and medium-sized businesses was just, okay, you can hire a Wall Street law firm and, pay $1,000 an hour for them to do your paperwork for you, or you can just give it up. Well, then the upshot of that is the big businesses are going to get their refunds, but the government can unlawfully take small and medium-sized businesses' money and never have to give it back. And to me, that just seems wrong.
Well, and there's a lot of things. I want to come right back to that, but I got to give you your props right here because I saw this, but then I forgot it, and I've been focused on trying to do this. Man, you are a very smart dude. You're academic up. You've got a Stanford Bachelor of Philosophy undergrad here, Bachelor of Science Mathematics, dual degree right there, Master in Philosophy, Stanford University, Stanford Law School, JD. PhD in philosophy from NYU. I mean, unbelievable. And you did some stuff over at Yale. I mean, you've been in some great institutions. You have a great education.
Well, thanks very much. My parents were really glad when I finally graduated for good and got a real job. I'll tell you that.
That I understand. I understand. And this is his LinkedIn page right here, Matthew Seligman, obviously of Stanford Grayhawk Law. I also want to let me do this. Let me make sure that I give some quick, and I'm going to go right back to what you were talking about because that is very fascinating. I wanted to talk to you about Mark Lemley, again, who put us in contact. The great Mark Lemley here, the William H. Newcomb Professor at Stanford Law School. Alumni of UC Berkeley School of Law, an IEP expert, no question about it. Mark Lemley is the William Newcomb. Well, that's very long. I'm not going to read all of this, but I mean, Lex Lumen. Listen, the guy, he is a definite big time scholar out there.
He's a superstar. He's just one of those. Let me sing Mark's praises.
Oh, go.
One of the most brilliant guys, one of the kindest guys you'll ever meet. And also, he does something that a lot of law professors, and especially law professors, I mean, he's probably the most prominent and most influential intellectual property law professor in the world and has been for years. Yeah. You know, since he was in his 30s, he was the most influential. And also, he's built a really robust legal practice while he's the world's leading authority on intellectual property law. So he's one of those really special people. He's a great guy. And also he has this beautiful, incredible combination of academic scholarship and practice.
No doubt about it. And listen, for the small, he's cool with me. We're in totally opposite ends of the political spectrum, and he lets it fly there on LinkedIn. I appreciate what he does. As you said, absolute legend, does incredible work. He loves video games. You got to love that. I mean, anyone that loves video games, you got to love that. No doubt about it. I mean, Mark is an absolute luminary. And like you said, a superstar, California lawyer of the lawyer attorney of the year twice. I mean, inaugural IP Vanguard Award. I mean, the dude, World Technology Award by the ABA. I mean, he's unbelievable. He's all over the place right here. He is a very, very well regarded. Lots of followers on LinkedIn. Everyone gets on his post, so you can check him out right here at Stanford Law School. No doubt about it. Now, I want to go back to what you were talking about, which is this. Okay, the firms paid the tariffs. They're due. You're saying they're due a refund. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, what about? And do you think that the lower court's going to find? Do you predict the lower court will find that? Number one, because the Supreme Court didn't say anything, but also like for the average person out there, they're thinking, mm-hmm. Okay, well, I paid more and the prices went up, and where do I get my money back? I think the answer you're saying is no. It's going to go to the firm. So is that like a corporate windfall? I mean, now that may just be what it is. Can walk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, so the technical legal answer is, yeah, that's right. So the way the trade law is set up is only the importer of record has a right to a refund of an overpayment of a tariff duty. And so the refunds, if they come at all, and again, I think they will as long as an importer takes the necessary procedural steps, that's just going to go to the importer. Okay, it's going to go to the company that paid the duty when the container ship showed up in the port. Now, the question then is whether that refund gets passed on to the consumers who did pay higher prices as a result of them. And the law doesn't have a clear solution to this. So I've heard some theories floated where maybe there could be a class action of consumers who could sue the company for unjust enrichment. But this is, like, I'm going to be honest, it's a bank shot. Maybe it ends up working better than I think, but that's not really the way the legal system is set up to handle this. And so if you think about when there's been cuts to corporate taxes, and sometimes those cuts to corporate taxes actually go back to the prior tax year. So that's a windfall to the corporation. Right. But even though the corporation's costs retroactively went down, the consumers who paid higher prices, they don't get a check in the mail from the
Very
corporation,
smart.
where Walmart says, actually, we got a corporate tax cut, so here's your refund for your dozen eggs. So yeah, this looks like it will be a windfall.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I wanted
Yeah.
to interject here for you to respond to. What's
Yeah.
interesting in this case, and maybe tricky, is a lot of people on the left, and again, not to make this political, but just trying to
Mhm.
framework here. Were saying, "Oh, this is," or critics, whatever, and people on the
Mhm.
right too. This is going to cause massive inflation. This is a tax increase. This is the
Mhm.
consumers are going to pay more, and that didn't happen. That a lot of the companies did not raise prices. They took a cut to margin, and so you have
Mhm.
different firms that did all kinds of different things. So it's really
Yeah.
kind of hard to unpack, right?
It absolutely is, and so President Trump, I think it was 3 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. So this is before this court struck down the tariffs. He published a guest opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, and most of it was sort of extolling what he viewed as the economic miracle that his tariffs had created in America. And then without sort of passing judgment myself, I'll say some critics said that the numbers weren't exactly on the up and up that he quoted. But there was a passage in there that talked about the incidence of the tariffs. And what the incidence is who's ultimately paying for it. Is it the company that cuts the check to the government, or does that importer pass it on to their consumers? And the sort of economic answer to this from theory was that most of it would be passed on to consumers. Not all of it, but most of it would be passed on to consumers. And it is true that less of it was passed on to consumers than economic theory had predicted it would be. Now, there are a lot of theories about why that was. I think, to me, the big explanation is that people were already sort of psychologically reeling from a higher cost of living. And so
Oh
if
yeah.
importers passed on even more costs to them, people are just going to throw up their hands and say, okay, I'm not going to buy anything at all. And so I think the company sort of read the market, read the consumer market, and decided that they could not pass on the same percentage of the tariffs
Customers are
as they
mad.
might have otherwise.
Mhm.
But as you say, this leads to a situation where there's just every single company who's making different decisions about how much they were going to pass on.
Exactly.
And so it's really incredibly difficult to unwind this completely. And frankly, it may end up being impossible to unwind it completely. Now, to be perfectly clear, I don't think the solution to this is that the government should get to keep the money that it illegally took.
Right, right, right.
And the question of, okay, once the companies get their refunds back, do they pass those savings on to consumers going forward? How do they do that? Well, I think the consumer market may have something to say about that, because this was the biggest news in the world on Friday, and it's not like consumers aren't aware,
Right.
that if all these refunds are coming, there may be sort of consumer demands that prices go down as a result. So we'll have to see how that works.
That's interesting, right? So maybe it's not you get money back, but maybe it's we're going to adjust prices going forward. It is very very interesting. Here, I wanted to throw this out here too for you to react to. This was, I believe, a little bit before Trump on Truth Social. I think this is one of his earlier reactions to the tariff, and he's had subsequent stuff. Trump on Truth Social here, based on thorough, detailed, and complete review of the ridiculous, this is Trump's, this is ridiculous, poorly written, and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday. So this must be Saturday, I'm assuming.
Mhm.
After many months of contemplation by the United States Supreme Court, please let this statement serve to represent that I, as President of the United States of America, will be effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been, quote unquote, ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution, parenthetical, until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. During the next short number of months, the Trump administration will determine and issue the new and legally permissible tariffs, which will continue our extraordinarily successful process of making America great again, greater than ever before. Thank you for your attention, Madam President Donald J. Trump. Now, is this the 232 and the 301? Is this the 5-month window that he can do some tariff thing, and then you go into negotiations? Tell us what he's talking about here, and sort of what these next steps are.
Yeah, so what we're going to see next is going to be an alphabet soup or a numerical soup of different sections that the president is going to rely on from different statutory authorities. And I think to understand what's going to happen next, what started happening on Friday and Saturday, let's rewind the clock a little bit to back to early 2025. Why didn't he just use these other statutes in the first place? And if these were such good statutes that were legal, and we'll get into that later, good legal bases for him to do his tariffs, why didn't he just use those in the first place? And the answer is because they have limitations. All of them have limits. They have procedural requirements and they have substantive limitations. And what he was trying to do with IEEPA, what ultimately didn't work, and is going to cost the administration however many hundreds of billions of dollars in hopefully refunds, is that they tried to do it with this shortcut using a statute that didn't ultimately authorize tariffs, but also didn't have conditions. Okay. Now, these other statutes, and we can go through a couple of them, do have conditions. The one he's referring to right now is called Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Okay. And what it says is that the president has authority to impose tariffs, duties, to address, quote, large and serious balance of payments deficits. And so balance of payments is related to trade deficits. It's a little bit different. It's sort of a different accounting measure, but there have been a balance of payment deficit for the United States for a very long time. So you might think, okay, this is a good fit. Why didn't he use it before? And the answer, so there are two answers to that. One is that the statute explicitly says that there is a maximum of 15%. And, President Trump was referencing that. And so something that he did, or at least tried to do under the prior tariff regime using IEEPA, if it authorized tariffs, there were no limits on what he could do. And so he went much higher than that. For the worldwide tariffs, he often went up to 50%. And with China, there was a point at which it was something like 147%.
Yeah,
And it was
really
changing all the time.
Right.
And so this lower cap wasn't what he wanted. Now, that's limitation number one.
Yep.
Limitation number two is that it can be for 150 days only, period. And so what Treasury Secretary Bessent said today in his interview with Maria Bartiromo is that this is going to serve as a bridge. So this is going to be in place for now until they do other stuff. Okay, what's that other stuff? And so these other statutory authorities are substantively limited in certain ways we can talk about, but more important and to the point, they require an investigation, usually by either the Secretary of Commerce or the U.S. Trade Representative, to do an investigation, make certain factual findings, publish those findings in the Federal Register, which is the sort of official government publication of all regulatory actions. And then there's an opportunity for comments on that, and then they have to have hearings about it, and so on. And so the administration has said they're going to try to do this on a rapid timescale. This is the sort of thing that historically, for rulemaking in general, and specifically for these investigations to impose tariffs and other kinds of trade sanctions, it usually takes years. So they're going to try to do this on a rapid timescale. And also, it's a lot of process, and also there's substantive limitations. And so a lot of these statutory authorities, for example, it's about national security, and it has to be country by country and product by product, usually. And so, President Trump and other presidents have used these other statutory authorities that say for national security reasons, you can impose tariffs after an investigation to impose tariffs on, for example, steel, aluminum, rare earth magnets. And the idea here is that, well, we can't. And look, even if you disagree with tariffs in general, there's this separate argument that it's important for the United States to have a manufacturing base of things like steel, things like rare earth magnets, which are essential for electric motors, which is sort of going to pharmaceuticals, et cetera, especially in case we get into a war, especially if we get into a war with China. And so there may be a national security justification, and indeed there have been tariffs over the last years for certain sort of strategic imports. But the problem with that is that for the president's purposes, that doesn't justify across the board every single product, every single country trade deficits. It's hard to say that every single thing that is imported from New Zealand threatens national security. And so there's going to be these they may say so, but then they're going to get sued in court. And then the courts are going to have to decide how much do we defer to the president's determination that the importation of, New Zealand wool is a national security threat. And so there is, the president was right about there being litigation about refunds. There's also going to be litigation about his attempts to impose what I anticipate will, again, be very broad tariffs using these other statutory authorities that are really designed to deal with discrete countries and discrete product categories.
That makes sense. And we all remember, or a lot of us remember, President Trump, I think Howard Lutnick out there with the big chart of the countries and the tariff amounts. And we're going to be, if they do it to us, we're doing it to them, the reciprocal tariffs. And some of these countries have, huge tariffs on us and have been doing it for a while. It's almost like a reverse Marshall Plan, if you will, or the extension of the Marshall Plan. We have been the country that is the biggest consumer base out there and the lowest overall, or certainly one of the lowest overall tariff bases. And then you have other countries that have very high tariffs and protectionist policies out there. But let me see if I can get into this a little bit as non-politically as I possibly can. Well, I don't know, that's maybe too strong, but try to do it non-politically to try to frame this a little bit. You're making great arguments. You're obviously very, very smart and obviously, an expert in this field. For the average viewer and listener out there thinking, okay, President Trump overstepped here and the court said that this is something that should, as you said, maybe like the war power should be, the taxing authority should be with Congress. Congress needs to step up, and maybe we're paging Mike Johnson pretty soon here. I mean, I'm sure that's already been done. But what about some critics out there that would say, hey, and maybe this is Trump saying, it's like, listen, the courts are hamstringing me. You've got these district judges that are trying to stop my policies, even on things like immigration enforcement that is directly under his purview, that is, federal, that is established out there, and he can't now. It's like you're talking about the process there. We have to have hearings on everyone, and it's this administrative bog down. I don't know if you want to weigh into that by itself, or do you feel like that is a fair or unfair potential critique of this decision? And where do you think that we are at with the legal profession and the judiciary at this point, if you feel like you can weigh in on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, holding aside my personal policy views about the wisdom of tariffs, and I think, sometimes these strategic imports, I think there can be good reasons for them. The broader ones, I think, are probably not good for the American economy or the American people. I just go back to the question of who decides, because if we want to make a transition to a constitutional system where the president just gets to decide what's best for America, you have to ask the question, well, what happens when the president is a guy who has different views?
100%.
And if you don't want to ask that question, then you're giving up on democracy. And so, it really comes to a sharp point pretty quickly. If you want to say, look, these tariffs are so important that we should just dissolve Congress or ignore Congress, ignore the courts, then you said that you care more about tariff policy than you care about the rule of law. You care more about tariff policy than you care about democracy. And so if the president's right about the economic miracle that his tariffs produced, campaign on that. Convince the American people that they are experiencing an economic rebirth, and then they're going to elect a Congress that's going to let you have all the tariffs you want. President Trump has made the claim that there's that economic rebirth. Now, it's certainly true that the American people don't believe it. And so that's why you see in polls by sort of legacy media, by even polls by sort of conservative leading media, that a strong majority of Americans don't support the tariff policy. Now, if President Trump is right about that this is actually the right thing to do, and we're already experiencing all those benefits, then he should go out and convince the American people. And if he can't do that, then his policy isn't working. And so the fundamental bedrock of how this political system of a rule of law democracy is supposed to work, if the court said you didn't have the power to do it, try to convince the people to give you the power.
No, I like it. I agree with you. I think that, I'm a big Trump supporter and everything like that, but I mean, that doesn't matter when it comes to this kind of thing. The more you talk and I think it through. Now, I'm kind of I learned under John Yoo over there at Berkeley, who's done a lot of constitutional stuff, and he and I agree on many things. There's some differences and stuff like that. Of course, I'm more of a, well, I'm not comparing to him, but I'm just saying I'm a strict constructionist, type of deal. Scalia, Alito, that kind of wing of the court, if you will. But it just seems like this does align a little bit more closely, and maybe I'm not the expert here, you are, with the war powers type of conversation, which is, and maybe that's a little bit more so, on the spectrum. But in other words, okay, the president, Congress has the power of war. The president can take some military action for some limited amount for some period of time, but at some point he's got to go to Congress and get this checked off on. Is that kind of where we're at? Like you can do, like you said, you can do some of the 302 stuff, some of the 232 stuff. You have 150 days. You have this process, but anything significant, you got to go to Congress and, like you said, campaign on it. Congress has to step up. You got to take it's a political move, and you have to take the political consequences.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Let's not forget that is, President Trump decided to use these other statutory authorities to try to, in the words of Secretary Bessent, recreate the tariffs that the Supreme Court struck down. And at no point in the last several days has he said, I'm going to go to Congress. We'll see what he says next week in the State of the Union. He could stand there and say, look, the Supreme Court said I didn't have the power to impose these tariffs that I believe have created an economic miracle. Now it's up to you, Congress, to give me that power, because that's what the American people are demanding. He could give that speech, and there's nothing stopping him from doing it. But instead, what we've seen already is he's trying to go around Congress. And so he's trying to say, look, all these other authorities that already exist, I'm going to try to stretch them. And, they let me do everything that I want already. And let's just not forget that there's always the option that he could try to persuade Congress. He could try to persuade the American people that it's good to have these tariffs.
This has been a great discussion. I want to cover a couple of quick points. Do I have a little bit more time with you?
Yeah, okay? Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to cover a couple questions here, three questions about what we think is going to happen in the future. And if you don't mind, and you don't have to, I wouldn't mind discussing a little bit, because I know this is something that Mark talks a lot about. And I don't know if you are in this conversation or not, but where we are with academia, with the legal profession, with judiciary, in terms of, liberal, conservative, is it, where we're at, where do we think that's going to go? And I'd love to get your quick thoughts on AI in the legal profession, but let's start. And again, you do not have to talk about anything that you're not fully comfortable talking about, and that's totally fine. You've been very gracious with your time. It's a great discussion. What do you think this is going to do with some of our existing trade deals? And I sensed, maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of sensed a little bit of touchiness, a little bit of nervousness with some of the administrative officials that were out on the Sunday shows there. We have a lot of, we have a big negotiation coming up with China again. What do you think this decision does to those discussions and those deals?
What we'll have to see. Time will tell. I think, from my perspective, I think there's been an open question about whether the deals that have been struck so far were actually real. The president secured these commitments for, the alleged investment of hundreds of billions of dollars in American manufacturing. How much of that has actually shown up? Well, it turns out Taiwan's commitment, well, actually, it was factories that were already under construction, during the Biden administration. Apple said they were going to invest, however many hundreds of billions of dollars, but it turns out that they had already spent it. And so, I do think that there's an open question about how many of those deals and, what part of those deals were actually new things that the president was able to extract using the leverage of the tariffs. Now, I think that the rest of the world definitely understands that the president is going to try to impose new and potentially even more draconian tariffs, using these different statutory authorities. But something else that I think has happened. So the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, so he's a He's somebody who's a very establishment guy. He was
Oh
on
yeah,
the
he might be.
board of governors for the Bank of England. Then he was on the board of governors for the Central Bank of Canada, and now he's the Prime Minister of Canada. He gave a speech at the Davos conference a
Yep.
couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
and he's very Canadian. He's a mild mannered guy, and he gave this speech that was really remarkable if you pay attention to international affairs and international economics, where he talked about how countries like Canada and Europe and the non-American, non-Chinese world is what he was really talking about, had to disengage from what he called the hegemon. And basically, what he was saying is that, since World War II, the United States has been an unrivaled power. There's the Soviet Union, and there was the Soviet Union sphere of influence. But, really, and especially since the 1990s, the United States has been an unrivaled power militarily, politically, and economically. And as Prime Minister Carney explained it, the way that sustained itself in large part was because the United States exercised restraint, that it didn't throw its weight around with the rest of the world. And so you didn't have a situation where Canada was like, okay, maybe we have to start making trade deals with China. Maybe we have to try to cut down our reliance on the United States and build up our economic integration with Europe or with South Asia or with South America. And one of the consequences of what happened over the last year is that the United States can't be trusted in the way that it once was to be a partner in trade, to be a partner in global affairs, because the president has, said things about, well, we want Greenland. And well, if you say that, it's going to be much more difficult for other countries to trust that you're going to act with restraint. And so there's sort of the narrow picture of, okay, the tariffs got struck down and the president's going to try to put new tariffs on. And what is that going to mean for the trade deals? But I think, the bigger picture here is that this is all part of the beginning of a story where the rest of the world doesn't view the United States necessarily as the indispensable nation anymore. I think that is an enormous strategic error for the United States to have made. I think that it is true that we have been the world's policeman, that we have expended enormous resources to protect other countries. It is also true that as a result of that, and as a result of that restraint, the rest of the world relied on us, and we could rely on it in ways that made America richer and safer. Now, so what we're going to see here is a multipolar world. What we're going to see is, a world in which it's not the United States and everybody else, where we're, maybe retreating to the Americas. You've seen the administration talking about how, well, we want to have this new Monroe Doctrine, where we're just focused on North and South America. Maybe that's what happens, but then we're sacrificing our influence with Asia, with Africa, and with Europe. And so, I'm not exactly sure how this is going to change out, how this is going to sort out in the long run, but I do think that we're seeing the beginning of a very big change.
I think that's right. Yeah, I do. I agree with you. I think that is definitely right. Whether it's the middle market sort of, yeah, I mean, and then you see these different, and I'm going to get it wrong, and I do apologize. That the turning points, like the 80-year cycles or something like that.
Yeah.
A lot of people are saying that we're in this area of big change, and let me. I don't know if I should pull that up here now or not, but I mean, and we see that with AI and robotics. There's a lot of things happening there. But do you think? Let me hit a couple more things real quick on this. Do you feel like the critics of Trump have been emboldened? Maybe his polls are down. He lost this thing. We're up in the midterms. If the Democrats can take over the House, maybe the Senate. I mean, where do you think Trump is with his ability to advance his agenda, and particularly when it comes to the trade agenda?
Well, I think there's not much prospect for his trade agenda moving forward in Congress, and that's true in the current Congress. They already tried and they didn't have the votes, and we can all read the political tea leaves that it seems unlikely at this point. There's a long time between now and November, but it seems unlikely that the Trump Republicans who would support his his tariffs are going to have, big increases in their numbers in Congress. It seems more likely, as you say, that the Democrats are going to take the House and maybe the Senate if the map lines up just right. So I don't think there's much prospect for Congress, passing new laws to support his trade agenda. And so then the question is going to be what the president chooses to do with his existing authorities, and whether the courts ultimately rule that that's legal or not. And so I think that the president is going to be able to do things. We are going to have these 150 days of 50% worldwide tariffs. I think there are some arguments that maybe it goes past his statutory authority, but at least for these 150 days up to this 15%, there's a pretty strong argument that this is legal. After that, we're gonna have to see how well they do the investigations. And I think one of the reasons why they didn't do that in the first place. I mean, remember that the worldwide tariffs weren't put in place on January 20th. They were put in place in April of 2025. They had enough time. If they can do this quickly now, they had enough time then. So why didn't they do it then? I think the answer is, well, the government in general, but specifically the Trump administration, and this Trump administration has really hollowed out its bureaucratic capacity. They came in famously with a chainsaw, and if you knew lawyers in DC, it's a completely new world. The Department of Justice is hollowed out. And so how many lawyers who were there before who know how to do an investigation under Section 201 are still there. I don't know the answer to that. So one of the big questions here is, even if they want to do things by the book, have they shot themselves in the foot by firing all the people who could actually do it?
Wow. So do you feel, okay, I'm trying to make this not such a big question, or at least a better question. The average person out there that says, hey, we've been getting ripped off, we want manufacturing base here. Other countries are doing this to us. I mean, obviously we know it's Congress, but do they have any hope out there? I mean, we have like AI, and then we'll get to that in a second. And wrap up. You know what I mean? Like we can say he did it wrong. Maybe this wasn't the right vehicle, but the attempt is to, bring certain things, at least some critical, national security type of manufacturing back to the U.S. Or is that a pipe dream that in globalization and competitive advantages with different economies and different costs and scales, is that just not going to happen? Was that just never realistic? Was that just political, fluff that just couldn't really, bear out here? Is that, I don't know if I'm making a decent question.
No, I get you. And, I think it's a really hard question. When I said before, when I was talking about Mark Carney's speech in Davos, you might hear what I said and think that, I'm actually I'm bearish on America. And I'm really not. I'm very bullish on America. We'll talk about AI in a minute, but, we have OpenAI. We have Google still innovating after all of these years. We have Anthropic. We have the best tech in the world. And the reason is, there are a lot of reasons for that. American institutions, and not just our government, but we do have the rule of law, shaky sometimes these days, but we do have the rule of law. We have an incredible education, especially higher education system. I'm an alma mater of, Stanford is my alma mater. I'm an alumni, and, all of Silicon Valley was born there. The possibility for innovation
Don't forget Berkeley.
Still exists. and Cal Berkeley. Rivals, but we're partners in that. So I'm so bullish on America, but the question that you're asking here is, what does that mean for ordinary Americans?
Right.
And one thing I can say is that I do think that there is the possibility of a bright and brighter future for ordinary Americans. I do think that it's going to look different than the past.
Right.
That's always the way that it happens. The way that 20th century America, the great American century, the way that was great for the American people to the extent that it was, and it depended who you are and where you lived and all sorts of things. But, the people who experienced a greater standard of living in the 1950s or the 1960s than they did 50 years before, it wasn't because they were doing the same jobs that they were doing in 1910. The invention of the automobile put a lot of horse and buggy drivers out of business.
Yeah.
Now, that's cold comfort for the horse and buggy drivers, and something that what the MAGA Republicans probably call me, sort of a cosmopolitan internationalist, and fair enough, I guess. But people who believe in free trade, people who believe that technological progress leads to a better economic well-being, we can't let people fall behind. And I think that's been a bipartisan issue. I think Republicans and Democrats. We had the promise of incredible technological innovation from the 1980s onward that did reduce American manufacturing jobs. And that was technology, and then globalization played a role too. And we said, okay, this is great. It's going to grow the pie, but then we didn't do enough to make sure that the rising tide, to mix metaphors here, that the rising tide actually lifted all boats. And so I think there's a real problem here, but I don't think that the solution to the problem is to try to wind back the clock. It's not even that I don't
Right.
think that that's the best thing to do. I just don't think it's possible.
No, 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 no. Right. I 100% agree. You're never going to stop change. Change is coming, and it only accelerates. I think that, and I talk to a lot of these people on X, and I like a lot of them. Don't get me wrong. I mean, a lot, but I mean, there's a lot of the billionaire class out there, particularly the tech bros, if you will,
Mhm.
where they're all well, and Ro Kahana was on this too. So it's not just, he's got excoriated for the wealth tax thing, but also on the
Mhm.
whether it's the H-1B visa issue, or it's
Mhm.
the outsourcing issue, or it's the immigration issue, or AI and robotics. And if you hear someone, and I understand these are, and again, we're not peace, love, freedom, opportunity, equality for everything for everyone. I'm just talking from an economic standpoint, exclusively. But I think that, and look, when you work in Silicon Valley, you have the world's best and brightest that come there, or great institutions like Stanford, Berkeley, and it's phenomenal. It is absolutely fantastic, and we always want to have top talent here. We want to draw top talent here. But at the same time, separate point. If you look, we've all seen these graphs. You see a graph of the productivity, and the profits have gone up and up and up from the last.
Mhm.
But wages, inflation adjusted wages have been basically stagnant, and now you're having, with the explosiveness of the recent inflation, people, they can't
Mhm.
afford. You have they have kind of a really negative mentality, the
Mhm.
youngest generation, because like, I'll never get a house, I might not get a girlfriend, and that's a whole different. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that goes on with this, where the economic prospects are pretty dim. At the same time, like, Elon and some others are like, hey, pretty soon you're not even gonna have to work, and I think that is. I love Elon, but I mean, I think that's way too optimistic of
Mhm.
a prediction. But I agree with you. I think this is maybe the political problem of our time, which is you can't wind back the clock. That's not going to happen. We do want to be connected to the globe. There is going to be global trade, but what do you do when the disruption is so immense? And we had the digital divide. I mean, it's the divide now is going to be crazy. Now, yes, AI does enable people. I mean, I wouldn't advise anyone to start doing a computer programming degree at this point. You know what I mean? Like, I talked to some of the dudes at Replit. I mean, this is a long question, but I think you get the gist of it, which is like, and maybe this goes outside of your purview, but I think that I agree with you 100%. You can't wind back the clock. You wouldn't want to. Maybe Trump's crude attempt, if you will, policy wise, was, let me just try to give Americans a little bit more time, or when the political, I don't know, I'm not in his head, I'm not going to ascribe values of it.
Mhm.
But I mean, I guess, do you feel like the political system is ready to deal with the enormity of change that is about to befall us? including the professions, and we'll flip to AI and the legal profession next.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is it's going to have to be. If I were a betting guy, I wouldn't say that the United States Congress is going to rise to the moment with a perfect policy solution. I think we have to sort of set our sights sort of a little bit more reasonably. But I do think that at the end of the day, the American people have the say. The real challenge is whether they vote for fool's gold, or they vote for the possibility of the best version of the future that we can get. And I do think that politics has been scrambled over the last decade,
Oh my God.
and so maybe some of the ways of thinking before didn't lead to the sort of economic and social stability that working and middle class people needed. Perhaps Donald Trump came in, promised the world, and people wanted to believe it. He had just a couple of blunt tools that it turns out were illegal, but probably weren't going to work anyway, to put it mildly. And so that doesn't answer the question. It leaves us with a point where we haven't even tried answering the question yet. And so what we have to do is we have to try to figure out, okay, so what does the future of a democratic egalitarian society look like in this new world where, yeah, AI is going to change the workforce. And, and it's been true for decades now that American manufacturing output today is higher than it's ever been. The difference is that many fewer people work in factories because in the 1950s, they didn't have the same technology. They didn't have robotics. And so as we see things, these technologies that are improving life in so many ways, there's so many people who are not dying of diseases now that because they've been cured. So their technological advances do improve human lives. But we also have to be mindful of the way that it displaces the old ways that people lived and worked. And we still are struggling with those solutions. What I can say is this has happened before. We had the Industrial Revolution where country after country moved from an agrarian society to one that was an industrialized society. It turned out great. When you ask Donald Trump when he wants to make America great again, does he want to make America great again to the 1840s before there were railroads and telegraphs? No. And so the point is that human societies have made these transitions through dramatic technological change before. It's not clear, and we don't have great answers to how human societies are going to make the transition through this next set of technological changes. And there are some who say, well, this is the big one. This is the one that's unlike any others. And that may be right.
Maybe, yeah.
And that's why Elon Musk talks about a universal basic income. He doesn't talk about, well, there are going to be new job categories that use AI. In the same way, there are new job categories that use cars instead of having horse and buggy drivers. That's not the way he's talking. The reason he's not talking that way is because he thinks that humans are going to become obsolete. And so that's the sort of technological utopian case. I don't think it's a social or political utopia in the economy, not with respect to human life. And so, well, is the universal basic income going to be the way to go? Could it even be done politically? These are big open questions, and I don't think we have answers yet.
No, and you're right. And I agree with you. And we've had the oligarchs before. And one of the things that Mark and I think also agree on is the need for, pretty effective antitrust enforcement and trying to get this is my law and economic side. Markets are great, but you need markets to work, right? And there's some market inefficiencies that government needs to step in there. But I think that part of what I was trying to inartfully say there a little bit is you're going to have, when the price of intelligence goes to zero, as Musk likes to say, you're having like investment banking, analysts, accounting, management consulting, obviously the lawyers, people that were able to work for a living and earn a wage, but able to earn, become rich or get a lot of money on that. You're going to have capital, people that have capital and ownership, and then you're going to have people, the middle class is going to get hollowed out to some, at least there's going to be some significant change, but the concern is that you're going to have very rich, and then you're going to have people that, have very little money. Are you worried about that? And we'll pivot, because I know we're going long here. Let's pivot to to also bring this into the table here, there's a lot of people in the Trump administration and conservatives that have critiqued, like, I was able to go to some very good schools, even though I'm very conservative. But I mean, I've definitely we if you're you may we all have our stories, right? We all have stories about that. Do you feel like that academia as an institution, the legal profession as an institution, has been captured significantly by the left? Is that changing? And what do you think that, and we see this with the change in Silicon Valley, it's changed much faster than I thought that it would, in terms of having a little bit more of an open discussion. I would not say that it's shifted to the right by any, but I think that you have maybe 20%, 1/3 that's maybe a little bit more on, openly, conservative now ish, if you will. And then you still have, and then also, how disruptive do you think AI is going to be for the legal profession and academia? So if people are not going to be able to, if you can't get this big job going to an MBA school, or like half those jobs are going to be gone now, or computer science, or, investment banking, and even VC that we talk, a lot of the VCs are like, yeah, the way we look at companies now and what we're investing in now is very different. What impact is that going to have, and maybe particularly focused on the law? So I know I put a lot out there. You take any of it or none of it as you wish.
Well, so I'll respond to your first point about the potential social consequences of AI.
Yeah.
Something that you hear about a lot if you read AI literature is this question of the alignment problem. So the alignment problem is this question about, okay, so if we have, if one of these companies creates, what they call the singularity, sort of the super intelligence that transcends human intelligence, the thing that people are sometimes scared about is, okay, so how do we make sure that AI, its interests, its goals, its aims are aligned with humanity's goals and aims? And, there's all sorts of sci-fi movies you can look at where the alignment problem was a problem. So down the road, technologically, maybe that is a problem. But I think that focusing on it maybe blinds us to the nearer problem, which isn't an alignment problem between super intelligent AI and humanity. It's between the people in humanity who own AI and everybody else. And so something that very well could happen, predictions are hard, as Yogi Berra said, especially about the future. But, something that we could see is, well, white collar workers don't have as many opportunities anymore. And the people who own AI, people who own the models, people who own the data centers and so on, they can accumulate a whole lot more wealth because they own, just to get really sort of political economic about it, they own the means of production.
Yeah.
And they don't need labor anymore.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, they can accumulate huge amounts of wealth. And everybody else is left, I hope that the realistic worst case scenario isn't that everybody else starves to death. But even still, you could have, instead of a country where there's huge wealth inequality and increasing wealth inequality, more in my view than there should be, but it could get a lot worse.
Oh, yeah.
That is a problem that I think the political system is going to have to deal with. And that's above and beyond just the sort of the ordinary displacement of white collar and blue collar workers due to technological change. And so I think that we as a society should yes, we should think about this longer term question about the alignment of super intelligent AI and whether it's going to try to kill us all. But we also have to think about what it might mean for a small handful of companies to own computer systems that, according to at least Elon Musk, but it's not just him, according to others as well, are going to make human intellectual labor obsolete. And so, look, I don't think that's going to happen in the near term. Now, but you look at how much improvement there's been in the models over the last couple of years. I don't know. It's hard to predict what the time frame is going to be here. And that leads maybe to your last question about what does it mean for the legal profession? I think it means change. I think in some respects it's probably overdue, in the sense that, so I've taught at a couple of different law schools, and I've had students who have gone on to, everywhere from being Supreme Court clerks to being attorneys who are doing sort of more commoditized work. And I think that, the the lawyers who are doing more commoditized work, document review type work, that's where AI is coming first. And so I guess my advice to young lawyers would be to try to figure out a way to practice law that can't be commoditized by computer programs, at least not soon. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do that. You can, have a set of skills that's really creative about deal making, maybe. I think a lot of it is going to be the jobs that require human interaction. It's yes, maybe people will trust a chatbot to give them legal advice one day, but that's not today. And so there are certain parts of the legal profession that I think are, if not indefinitely and permanently immune from the risk that AI makes those jobs, less lucrative or maybe even just not exist. But try to position yourself in the areas of legal profession where it depends on more human skills.
Last question. I want to get your comment on education. You've been at the top institutions, obviously Stanford, premier. Do you think that education is going to become more democratized? Do you think that it's going to become cheaper? Or do you think that we're still going to see schools the way they are as sort of a club or filter? I mean, there's a lot of these tech bros are saying, hey, you don't even need school. Joe Lonsdale and with Barry Weiss has done his own thing there. UT Austin out there. A lot of people are pushing, I want to call it alpha for the kids out there out of Texas for the AI learning. And they're saying they're getting great results. Do you have a vibe on what's going to happen for the elite American university system?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I received incredible education at the institutions that I attended, and also it's open doors. There's no denying that. Is it going to mean the same thing in the future? Well, probably not quite the same thing. But I also think that you should be really careful about taking advice about not going to college from somebody has graduate degrees. And you should be really careful about saying that Mark Zuckerberg didn't graduate from college. And also most people who didn't graduate from college around when he would have, they are not billionaires. And so the fact that some people have succeeded without education doesn't mean that everybody without degrees will succeed. Now, that doesn't mean there's one path to success. I think that it's also probably true that American society sort of ended up relying on the traditional 4-year degree program to fill a lot of different roles in American society where it wasn't necessarily well suited. Now, I personally, look, I've got a PhD in philosophy. I think, everybody should have the opportunity to spend a couple of years reading some books to think about how they fit into the world, how they fit into society, how they relate to other people. But if you're thinking of it just in terms of job training, yeah, so 4-year degrees may not be the thing for everybody. And I think to the extent that we have a little bit more of a flexible idea in institutions to support different types of paths, I think that's a good thing. I don't think it means that college is dead, though. I don't think it means that law school is dead.
No, but I could see it becoming a much more practical. I know Adam's did some good work at Berkeley. I've tried to do some stuff at Berkeley. I know Stanford and others are coming out with things that are like executive stuff to engage industry on specific things that are relevant now. So I could see more things happening there. But man, this has been an incredible conversation. You are so smart. I'd love to talk to you again. Anything that I missed? Anything that you want to say in closing? I don't want to stop you from getting something out that you want to get out.
No, not at all. I'll just remind people. So I am, I am representing clients who are seeking these refunds. Our conversation sort of started out on narrow, but then, it's these tariffs were an attempt to solve a big social problem at a critical point in history. It turns out it was illegal, and we've got these questions about how whether and how the refunds are going to come, but it does implicate these broader societal trends that, we as a society are trying to grapple with. I don't think that this was a good idea about how to deal with it because, as we said, I don't think you can wind back the clock. There's a narrow question about, how people who paid these tariffs can get their money back. And people can contact me at Grayhawk Law. And so the email address you can email is info@grayhawklaw.com. But also I think people should be thinking about the bigger question. What problem were the tariffs trying to solve? And that problem doesn't go away just because this wasn't going to work and was illegal anyway.
I love it. Matthew Seligman at Grayhawk Law and Stanford Law School. Unbelievable. Really, really smart dude. And of course, big thanks to Mark Lemley out there who helped you with this amicus brief and that was successful up there on that side for the Supreme Court. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Appreciate all the viewers out there. Any questions, you can obviously follow up in the comments below. And then you can, of course, see Matthew and at Grayhawk Law. My name is John D. Villarreal. Thanks so much for joining us.